Hi there. This is Clifford Bates. This is my attempt to, again, try to deal with the questions of political science and the origins of political science. Now, I'm wishing to continue my talk about Aristotle's political science, and particularly his discussion of regime change that we find in Politics, Book 5. Now, I have talked about Aristotle is said to be the father of modern political science, not modern, but political science. Why is that? Because he gives a kind of an analytic and rational model to try to understand political things. But a lot of times, contemporary political scientists take say, well, he's out of date. He doesn't talk about the state. He talks about the polis, and polis is no longer, and the phenomena that he is addressing has no longer relevant, and his whole model is too legalistic, and he tends to deal with things in a way that is longer relevant. Now, again, this is my book that I wrote last year. And in that book, I address a lot of these issues and I make the case for the centrality of the regime. Now, I have elsewhere on YouTube talked about what the regime is and how it operates. I also have dealt with the background of the different forms of rule and how that connects to the question of the regime. Now, but in this little talk, I want to talk about the way regime change happens, how regimes operate, how it moves from one type of regime to another. Now, to understand the regime, we have to understand it as a composite of a given community. Now, here, unlike the modern idea of the state or the nation, Aristotle's idea is that political community is not as logically or intellectually tied to a single type of unit. Although he focuses on what he calls the polis, the political community, what that is merely this kind of natural, logical entity of that shapes political life in a given community. Now, how that is, now for most of us today, we live in modern states. Now, the question is, well, are modern states similar to polis? Well, yes and no. It differs. It does differ. The nation-state model and the modern state is in many ways a replacement for what Aristotle talked about the regime. And I mentioned that in a little bit in my book about how the state seeks to replace what Aristotle understood what the purpose of what the regime served. Now, yet, nevertheless, the reality of human political life remains, and that what Aristotle teaches is simply the way human beings operate here in the real world, and that even though we might conceptually have this tool of the state being the frame by which we think we're operating, but reality we're not. We're still operating within the context of these natural political communities. Even though that this political community activity operates within the frameworks of nation states, so even though the entity in question is not the same as the polis, but in practice and operation it is, and this is mostly due to changes of technology. Why? Because of things like the internet, radio. This has broadened the way people's vocal communications and ability to communicate allows for the arena of the political community to be enlarged. Now, the first major stepping moment was the Gutenberg Revolution. Without the Gutenberg Revolution, and what it provided for the ability for linguistic centralization, the nation state would never have been able to be effective. Aristotle always, in his Politics, always thought the nation, or the ethnoi, was defective politically, and the reason why it was defective politically was that it couldn't have the same effect as a political community. Yes, empires could, but empires were just domination of one political system over another political system by rules and regulations. Not truly a political community. what the state does allow, and the technology of the Gutenberg Revolution allowed for, was the ability of small communities to, to have a common language, to have the ability to have effective communication. Now, with broadcast media, radio, TV, now internet, this only expands the ability of the scope by which communities can form, and therefore natural communities will emerge. Now, this does pose a problem of the fact that these technologies do allow to bypass and create problems regarding territoriality. But again, this is something that language itself caused a problem with, in particular with different languages, and that therefore this will only make Aristotle would argue that this only would make our politics a little more complex, and perhaps maybe even less unitive and more divisive than what the political reality of the nation state could tolerate. So again, let us look at the question of the regime. What did the regime do? The regime was basically the way we are to understand the political form. The political form here is the question of the political community, the given political community that we're operating with. And the form of it was the shape that it took, the institutions, the habits, the customs. And again, by looking at the famous Aristotle's four causal model of the material cause, the matter that's made of, the formal cause, that of what is the form or the shape or the way it looks and structured. The structural shape, structuralism in this sense, the material, I said matter already, the efficient, which means the things the historical sequential things that led to the next event, and then finally the final cause, the goals, the values, the ends, the purposes for what things are set for, the ideas of justice. The view of the good and the just. All of these are in fact many ways that we understand political behavior. Now, these are the way any political community operates. So in this line, we look at a political community, there's going to be, different groups within that community. You're going to have the wealthy and the poor. You're going to have those who, and their way of life that they have will differ greatly. Now, Aristotle goes into this all in Book 4. So in Book 4, we get this huge account of the way the political community and the regime, the politeia, operates at this level of at rest. I would say it's the analysis of the political regime at rest. Now, what I'm talking about here today is looking at Politics 5. And this is not the regime at rest. This is the regime in motion. This is the regime. Why does it change? Why will it go from one regime to another? Now, at Politics 5, Book 5, Chapter 1, Aristotle makes a very important thing here. He lists 3 specific questions that is going to frame his analysis of about the examination of regime change. And that is, what brings about this thing called metobale, which is revolutions in regimes. Now, why do they happen? And he's going to basically argue, what brings them about is, many things. One is that there could be a change in the material. If there's any real change in how the regime is constituted, that could cause a regime. A change in the rulers, that can cause a revolution. Or, in a change between one group of rulers and another group of rulers. The change in the nature of the rulers, a change in their values, a change of many things could be the reason for change. Things, they could be big or they could be small. So regime change is a very important concept and one that is very complex. The second thing is he asks the question of how many changes are there. Now, this is the big question. How many different changes? Now, he talks about, there's a twofold element. He argued in Book Politics 4, Chapter 4, and Chapter 6, And likewise, and same thing in book 6, chapter 4, of that in democracy and oligarchies, there's multiple forms, there's sub-varieties of democracies, and there's sub-varieties of oligarchies. Now, the argument here is that that the regime forms vary amongst themselves. The classic is the difference between the few and the many, the wealthy, the poor, and therefore the different regimes between where regimes based on the claims of justice of the rich being that of the rich should rule, and wealth should be the basis of who determines who should have the authority in the community, or one where the belief that everyone is equal and no man was so better that they're or has such virtue that they has a right to rule over their fellow human being. So that's the famous democratic claim, that therefore everyone is equal to everyone else, and therefore the majority should rule. Okay, that's the classic democratic claim. All these claims, all these things, these are the view of justice, the claim of justice. These are very much the teleological view of the regime, and therefore a regime has an element of not only the structural element of it, how they're composed, the material element, the people who compose it. 2, the structural element, the institutions and structures that shape and make it up and support it and or moderate it. And then there is the kind of this conception of the virtues, the claims, the goals, the views of justice, the direction that the regime wishes to go in. And then you have the question of the thing that came before it. What preceded it? What led to it? So therefore, this is how the regime is understood, and therefore, how the regime will change from one form to another form will happen not only between types of regimes, but within type as well. So therefore, that leads us to a famous question, Aristotle: how many regimes are there? And then how many sub-regimes are there? And then therefore you have the matrix of the possible varieties of change that can happen. And if you look at Aristotle's matrix here, and we work it out, this model is a much more complex and dynamic model than anything contemporary political science offers to understand how this operates. And this is why I've always been more impressed. After years of studying Fukuyama and Huntington and people like Feiner and these important post-World War II school of comparative political science, I have always been less impressed by them than by Aristotle. Simply because he offers a much fundamental, larger, more dynamic picture that allows for kind of an interplay between both a descriptive, empirical model of analysis as well as a thick descriptive model of analysis. And one that can, and it allows us also to see a genealogical dimension of it as well as one that can be tested and verified by the standard models of political science. So again, he's offering you the perestroika model that everyone wanted in the 1990s, but no one bothered to look at. Now, let me turn to the second part. Now, we went to the third question is, what sort are they? What are the causes of this? Now, in chapter 2 of, not chapter 2, but the second, right after book 5, Politics 1, the second paragraph in that first chapter, he then leads us to basically, okay, why does a regime destruct? Or what forces a regime? What will lead a regime to kind of collapse? Again, look at each one of these elements: the material, the structural, the values. The final causes. Any one of these can be the reason why that leads to a kind of problem within the structure of the regime. He makes clear about this. And then he says, okay, into which sort of regime is the most particular, that one regime transforms into? Now, this is a big question. Now, historical circumstances may lead to one type of regime being formed because of the situation, the environmental situation, the accidental characteristic of something. The way a regime can come to be may be unique. And what happens at this certain time, as populations grow, as dynamics change, as the economic situation changes, new situations will happen that you can't go back and change back to the old order. It's not like you can always go back to the old order. Sometimes because the conditions that made the old situation possible is simply no longer. In other words, if you had a farming democracy now, and you're no longer farmers, it's very, very difficult to reestablish the kind of egalitarian farmer democratic model of a regime. It just simply won't work. It will be resisted by populations who would view the kind of agrarian republic as a aristocratic and autocratic system, particularly urban democracy. Now, and whereas urban democracies may appear to be mob rule in the eyes of an agrarian democratic model. So therefore, this is a very complex problem of how do we understand how and what is possible. In other words, not only how does regimes go from one type to another, but what is the range of possibilities that are even possible within this? This leads to, in the third paragraph, to other questions. What are the sources of preservation? Now, this is the famous structure of Book 5, he argues. So, what are the regime changes of this? How they're going to change? What are the most common change types? Then he structures the question here in Book 5 to look into this question of, well, what are the how do you prevent revolutions? What do you do to preserve change? And fourth, for each of, not only in general, how to prevent change from one thing as a general rule, but for particular regimes themselves. So again, this chapter 1 of Politics 5 offers a very, very general structure of how he's going to proceed. But what's funny here is that he breaks it. He doesn't deliver it. Again, this is very similar to what Machiavelli does in chapter 1 of The Prince. He promises a structure, and then he doesn't deliver. Now, he adds more than he delivers in The Prince. Here, Aristotle does like this. In fact, if we look at the structure of Politics 5 here, we get chapter 1 gives us most of the outline up until chapter 10 and 11, the discussion on tyranny, which doesn't. In other words, he talks about the revolutions in general, and then he talks about revolutions because of democracies, oligarchies, and something aristocracies, and then he talks about preservations in general, and then preservations of democracies and oligarchies, and that. And then he talks about tyranny in chapter 10 and 11. And then he finishes off in the last chapter, chapter 12, of just kind of finishing up the discussion of tyrannies that lasted longer than they were supposed to, and a criticism of Plato's cycle of regimes. Now, I mentioned this only so you can see something going on here. That therefore, I argue that maybe the discussion of a monarchical rule, is actually kind of a microcosm of the politics as a whole. This idea was kind of hinted to me by